in Massachusetts. As you know, Todd, you know this story, but for you all who may not have heard my background, most of my ministry has been in parish ministry. I've been a priest for 33 years, and 23 of those years as working as a parish priest in 3 different places. After graduating from Virginia Seminary, I served at a church outside of Philadelphia as a curate called St. Thomas's White Marsh, and I was there for about 2.5 years. And well, I'll come back to Swanee in a minute.
There you go.
But so after serving at St. Thomas's, I moved on and was an assistant rector at Church of the Redeemer, Chestnut Hill, outside of Boston, just west of the city near Boston College campus. And I was there for 4.5 years. And then I was called to be rector of St. Michael's Church in Milton, Massachusetts, which is a little town just south of Boston, borders the Dorchester neighborhood. And I was there at St. Michael's as rector for 16 years until Bishop Shaw, who was the bishop in Massachusetts at the time, asked me to come to work for him at the diocesan, on the diocesan staff, but really with a time certain kind of arrangement of a 5-year special project to develop local missional partnerships with our congregations sort of regionally across Eastern Mass, and then also encourage global mission partnerships with partners across the globe in our congregations. And there was some other work around the edges of that, but that was the focal point. I did that for the 5 years, or a little less than that. We finished up in about 4 years. By that time, Bishop Shaw had retired. Bishop Alan Gates had been elected, and he asked me to stay on when I finished the missional work and serve as his acting chief of staff. And it was while I was serving as his acting chief of staff that I began the discernment process with y'all here in North Carolina. And so grateful to be here, so delighted 3 years into this to be your bishop, to have been given the trust that you placed in me at the election and in our life together since then. The last few months for all of us have been extremely challenging, but also I think we've grown together and we've continued to learn from each other. And there is a sense of unity and spirit and creativity in this challenging time. So there's probably other things I could say, but that's enough of a brief overview.
Well, that's great. And sorry, I disrupted. I put up my Swanee cup. When I hear another seminary, I had to at least represent Swanee. So
want to thank you for drawing me back to that. One of the gifts and privileges that comes with being a bishop in North Carolina is that you are automatically considered what they call an owning bishop, because North Carolina was one of the founding dioceses of the University of the South at Swanee. What that means is I serve on the board of trustees. What that also means is that because of that relationship and history, I'm granted an honorary degree. So although it wasn't earned, I do have a degree from Swanee as well as VTS. So
there you go. Well, we can proceed then. That's good. I like that. So, well, and Bishop, you've been here just over 3 years now, correct? And so, how's life as a bishop been different, or what? How is it what you expected, or maybe not what you expected, or maybe a combination of both? I mean,
a little of both, Todd. Actually, so say a quick word about that. Just having served in Massachusetts for 2 bishops, one who Bishop Shaw, when he retired, had served there 20 years. So he was a long-serving bishop when I began to work with him. And then in the early years of Bishop Gates' service as bishop, service and leadership as bishop. So I actually had a wonderful opportunity to see a bit up close of what it was like to be a long-standing bishop and what it was like to be a brand new bishop. So I had some expectations coming here. But of course, the reality here is that you all exceeded my expectations in terms of the wonderful congregational life that's here, the deep clergy collegiality that is shared across this diocese, the strength of lay leadership. I often talk about the deep bench that we have here in the Diocese of North Carolina, and the way that everybody has really coalesced before I got here around the Jesus movement, which has kind of shifted into the work that we're doing around becoming beloved community. And that gives me life and joy every single day. And I tremendously miss the visitations. And it's one of the reasons I'm grateful tonight that at least we can connect this way through the Zoom and Facebook Live and have an opportunity to have some conversation and question and answer and reconnect with you all at St. Margaret's, because it's been too long since I've seen you.
Yeah, we're glad you're here, and this certainly, I mean, as you said, Bishop, this is just a strange time. When you and I talked on the phone, maybe last week, I think I mentioned to you then I never, in my wildest dreams, in March, thought that we'd be sitting here in August trying to figure out how can we get churches open, when are they going to be open, what does preschool look like. I really thought a couple months this thing's going to die down and we'll be in better shape. And this has really been a surprise, I think, for all of us. And trying and finding out how to maintain relationships during all that and stay connected has been a real challenge. Certainly the parish level. How's that? So as we start talking about the pandemic, how's it been for you personally as the Bishop of North Carolina to navigate through this pandemic? Because this is just something I don't think any of us really ever prepared for or thought of, and at least in this way I didn't. So
I agree with you, Todd. In hindsight, I wonder why I didn't imagine this as a possibility, but it just wasn't on my radar, and I think that's true for many of us. The experiences we've had in the past of pandemics have not been, at least in my lifetime, at this scale. So I know historically there have been precedents for this, but nothing in our lifetime, at least, and I'm 61. So that being said, the challenge, of course, has been the relational challenge. And that's really at the heart of who we are as disciples of Jesus and as apostles of the gospel. We are in relationship and in community with each other. And so how do you create that in a situation where everything that you normally do to bring that to life is interrupted in a significant way? And there's some things that we sort of figured out early on. I'm blessed with a great staff who jumped into this with with both feet and full hearts and said, we can figure this out together. We started, as you know, Todd, having calls twice a week with clergy and lay leaders across the diocese in the Zoom format. It's not ideal. Nobody likes living in a box, and these boxes are, the more people on the call, the smaller the boxes.
right.
That being said, at least we can see each other face to face, we can hear each other, and we can wrestle together with the challenges that are before us. And that's been tremendously rich in terms of both the creativity, the dialogue and conversation, the great questions, and the way that we've navigated some of the thorny issues. It's not been easy by any stretch, but it's been good, honest, solid. It has built relationship. I do feel that our trust level has increased in this time. In addition, our staff was meeting also twice a week on Zoom calls, in addition to our regular full schedule, but just to spend intentional staff time, not only looking at the challenges we were trying to address, but also trying to pay attention to caring for one another. Yeah. And that is, of course, one of the other important pieces in all this work that we've been engaged in. So, as I said earlier, the single biggest disruption has been the cessation, if that's the right word, but for almost 4 months at least, maybe going on 5
months. Yeah,
5 months. We have not been able to worship together in person in a way that we're confident is safe for everyone. Although we have a plan and we have protocols for that plan, the numbers here have really indicated to us that we need to move more slowly than any of us imagined. So the last thing I'll say, and then you can ask other questions as well, but the duration of this has been one of the striking and most challenging pieces. Last thing I'll say is, in New England, they often talk about, and maybe here as well, duration storms. In the winter, that means the longer the storm, the more snow piles up because the storm sits and spins and just dumps precipitation. Hurricanes do the same thing, as we well know. Well, the hurricane that we had yesterday actually was a fast mover, which spared us a lot of the danger and damage. The pandemic is more like a duration storm. It sits and it spins and it wears us down, and it's been a trial. It has not been easy for any of us.
Yeah, I can imagine. And with that, I'm going to ask you a couple of personal questions before we get into some of the more church things. But one of the things that you mentioned intrigued me. So as we talk about, you talk about the staff and how to keep the staff healthy and taking care of themselves, because just this, at least what I'm finding functioning in this electronic format has its own sort of subtle ways of wearing you down, or just, it's just a different feeling. I don't even know how to really describe it. But on a personal level, so as bishop, what have you, and this question has been asked for me of my parishioners to me, but what have you done as a bishop in order to keep yourself healthy? Because what can often happen is you're the bishop taking care of everybody around you. You and Bishop Ann have that role, but what can sometimes happen, depending on our personalities, is we can forget to take care of ourselves. A parishioner of St. Margaret's for many, many years, who passed away a few years ago, she had a great analogy. She's like, when you're in an airplane and the pressure goes down, and the mask comes off, the first thing to tell you to do is put your mask on first, because you can't help anybody else until you get your oxygen. So what does that look like for you in your personal life, if you don't mind sharing that, or what's that been like as bishop?
Thanks, Todd. I love the question, and I love the analogy too of the mask dropping down from the airplane.
That's courtesy of Pat Hansen. She was here before the church started, and she lovely lady, passed away just a few years ago. Was a deep person of prayer, but she passed on a lot of great truths, and that was one of them to me as an analogy. So
yeah, well, and of course it does start with prayer, and really leaning into my prayer life. That was something, this all kind of coincided with around the beginning of Lent, and it was something I committed to, but to really spend not only more intentional time in prayer and doing the daily office, which I do in the morning. I'm a morning person, so I'm up early. I have a place in the house that's kind of it's not a chapel formally, but it's the place I sit and pray each day, and do the daily office. And then I'll usually pick just a short word or phrase from scripture or from one of the collects, and then I'll meditate on that. And I find that grounds me not only in the experience of prayer in the moment, but then it becomes a touchstone for me for the rest of the day and for the ups and downs and the various challenges. And it helps me stay focused on the presence of God among us, within us, guiding us, the Holy Spirit, really being our companion in this, and a comforter, because gosh knows we've needed comfort at times, and really paying attention to the gift of Jesus's promises to us through all of this. And lo, I am with you even to the end of the age. Right. In addition, physical exercise. I actually went pretty regularly to the YMCA, and that's been shut down, still is shut down. So the exercise is converted or reverted, if you will, to walking. But my wife and I try and walk usually a couple miles each day. It's a chance to unwind, to talk, to get out and enjoy the beauty of our neighborhood, and wave to neighbors from a safe distance. And so reading is another thing that I find often when I'm on the road, which I was, just a quick footnote, my mileage on my car averaged about 2,000 miles a month, which is significant. It's not huge, but it's significant, traveling all around our diocese. Just as a contrast, I filled up my gas tank on March 15th. I filled it up again May 15th, and then again July 15th. And I don't think I've put on 200 miles in that time.
I know, this is crazy.
Yeah, but so without that travel time, it's given me more time to read, and I love to read. And I've been doing some reading. When we started, I was reading one of the Lenten Read books, Waking Up White, by Debbie Irving, which I really enjoyed, and enjoyed some of the Facebook exchanges around that reading. I also am a sports nut, and I read a biography. Don't shoot me when I say this. It was the biography of Bill Belichick, the coach of the Patriots.
There you go.
I can qualify that by saying I didn't read it as a Belichick fan, but I was fascinated to learn more about him and the success that he's had, and some of the ethical questions that are raised by some of what the Patriots the scandals that they've been involved in.
Well, I
So
mean, pretty much most people do know that they cheated to all 6 Super Bowls, so that's not really. I understand that. So,
I
no,
think
but
that's been established, right?
but you're from New England. You should be rooting for the Patriots. We kind of get that down here. We really do. So, another personal question, and then we'll get on some of the church stuff. And this is something that I sort of grapple with because on a personal level, I'm curious as to what your response to this is, because I don't believe that God causes this kind of suffering or doesn't. He doesn't bring viruses into the world in order to do something or punish us. I certainly don't believe that, but I do believe in the midst of these difficult times, God can show us something new, or God wants us to learn something personally. So for me, what I've learned during this pandemic is I think what God's working on me right now is that I like to plan 6 months and 12 months out and sort of see what it's going to look like and how can you vision that. And I can't plan for 1 week away. I don't know what tomorrow's going to look like. And so I'm really forced in a particular way to live in the moment in a way that I've never had to before. Like I've just got to worry about today as Dana, who's my preschool director, we're talking about, and with the diocese about preschool, we sort of adopted this philosophy. What are the 2 things we can do today to bring clarity? And that's about the way I've been functioning, which is very different from the way I've been functioning before. And I think maybe God's trying to help me learn something in the midst of this difficult time. And I don't know if he's shown you anything or if that resonates with you, but anything come to mind as I ask that question, something that sort of changed your perspective or challenged you in a way you weren't expecting?
Yeah, that resonates deeply with me, Todd. In part, you talked about yourself being a planner, and that was one of the, as I understood it, that was one of the reasons I was called, is to give some shape and direction to the Jesus movement in the North Carolina diocese, and to kind of figure out some of the marks for what beloved community looks like and move us towards them. And we were just building out a mission strategy. We had a retreat with the standing committee, diocesan council, with the staff, and we building out these goals. And that was in January and February, and then whammo, March hits. Yeah. And it was like, and we set that aside, obviously, for a long period of time. And I've been trying to get back to it. And even as I try to get back to it, there's part of me that says, how do you plan? And how do you know when some of these things we can pick up again and get back to? And so we're still sorting that out as a staff.
Or does the world even look the same, right? When we come, what are we coming back to? All this planning that we've done, will it be the same? Yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge, isn't it?
Well, and your observation there, Todd, is a perfect lead into something I shared on the call this morning, which is really, we had task force working groups in sort of 10 different areas across the diocese. And one of the working groups was focused on newcomers. And their challenge was, well, how will we be welcoming newcomers when we are able to worship in person again, either outdoors or indoors or both? And we will still have people in our community who have connected to our congregation who are online members. And how do we welcome those newcomers when we're back in a space together with each other, physically present to each other? And the group was wrestling with this and really struggling. And at one point, one of the co-chairs said, I think it was one of the co-chairs said, the truth is we are all newcomers at this point. And it just opened the door. And that kind of epiphany for me, in hearing them say that, that's a learning that has come out of this that I've tried to appropriate in terms of my perspective. Because as we make our way back, and we are slowly making our way back, we are not the same. And that's okay. And it doesn't mean everything we love and is familiar is gone, but something has shifted, and we need to honor that. We need to incorporate that. We need to embrace that, because that is something that, even out of a horrific situation, that is something that can become an invitation to mission. And that's what we're trying to pay attention to.
Yeah, because it's going to be really interesting, because even when we get back to the doors, it's just going to look and feel different. I mean, to not do congregational singing for however long that is, to not be able to embrace at the peace or whatever the customs are locally. For those folks that, for whatever reason, aren't able to be with us, whether by health reasons or for whatever, there is this virtual aspect that we've dabbled in, but now it's going to become a part of who we are. and trying to figure out what that looks like, and sacramentally how to navigate through that. It's going to be fascinating to do all of that. And so I think I think things are going to be very different for at least a long while, and we probably will never go quite back to exactly what we were. So with that, I mean, that's a perfect segue, actually, Bishop, because today the governor had his kind of bi-weekly, I guess, or every week, whatever he did. He did his update today, and so I watched that with some intentionality today, and he's extended. I don't even know what these stages are anymore. I think it's stage 2 with the stay at home. There's like this qualifier, like it's not really, there was stage 2, then there's stage 2, stay at home somehow. But whatever stage we're in with that stage, we'll say 2B for our purposes. He's extended that for 5 weeks. And certainly as you can imagine, and I'm sure this is not unique to St. Margaret's. And a reminder, this, if you have questions for the bishop, you can type those into the comments section, and we'll get those to the bishop as we're talking. It doesn't have to be just the two of us. But I know there's a lot of energy at St. Margaret's about when can we begin to worship, what is outdoor coming, is in-person coming. And I know I'm not here to put you on the spot because there's no date, and everyone knows there's no date, but where do you feel today we are with the opening plans? I know we have the plans done, but any sense for, it feels like we can see a light at the end of the tunnel, but I don't know if that's just me or being hopeful or not. But what's your thought on that? Because I know there's a lot of energy for our folks around that. When can we get worshiping again together in some fashion?
Yeah, that's great, Todd. And I find myself, especially within the last week, feeling more and more that we are getting close to that first next step. And that would be, we're calling it 1B. Our stages kind of parallel the governor's phases, but we started with 1, and he's already in 2.
Yeah, we're like one number behind. Yeah, our 1 is his 2, so I think.
but what I said on the call this morning with the lay and clergy leaders was the numbers in terms of the percentage of positive cases versus those that have been tested. That number is starting to show over the last 5 days a decline. There's a little up and down, but the trend is downward. And if we see that continuing on that trajectory, flat or down through the early part of next week, we are prepared on Tuesday of next week to signal that we can go to stage 1B, which does include outdoor worship. In order, and on a slightly still limited basis, some indoor worship, but it's not stage 2. It's not 25 people even yet in there. It just means there's some a little bit of pastoral flexibility on the indoor worship, but certainly outdoor worship.
Yeah, okay. So for folks that may not know what 1B looks like, so do we have parameters on, is there a limitation on numbers for that, or what is Eucharist allowed, not allowed? So what are a lot of folks don't know what that is here. So
right. So 1B, thank you, Todd. 1B essentially means outdoor worship is allowed up to 25 people, socially distanced with masks. We already have a model for morning prayer that we piloted in a couple of churches. That's worked well, and the safety indicators are good with that. We are still working on a protocol for communion, which could be offered outside. We're not quite there in terms of the model, but we're close, and we think that may be ready by early next week as well. Keep in mind that local leadership gets to decide. Just because we say something is allowed doesn't mean you need to do it if you're not ready to do it. So we're trying to create a pathway and allow for greater opportunity for in-person worship as we make our way through these stages. But you can choose to go slower if that's more comfortable for you and your congregation.
I got you. And as you talk about Eucharist, I throw this out just as an aside. I ordered several months ago. Again, I didn't think we were going to be out quite this long, but I never heard of this before. I actually got this. I saw a Facebook post from our fellow clergy, Father Steve Rice, over in St. Timothy's, Winston-Salem, and he put a picture of what was termed Episcopal pincers, which I'd never heard of before. and so I was intrigued, and they were pretty reasonably priced. So I got a couple of those, and so that's at least, I don't know what the thought is of the diocese, but at least at some point that might be a way, because it's a way to distribute without touching anything, which is, and it's actually designed pretty well, where one of the tongs, for lack of a better word, it's longer than the other. So if you grab a host with one of them on top and slide it to the side, the one that's longer is on the bottom, and it perfectly grabs the host for you. I thought, well, somebody thought this through. And so it's just a way we thought this might be possible, where there wouldn't be any touching. If you were masked, it might be a way to distribute. So I know that there's other parameters, and that may not be one of the parameters, but it was just, I found this pincer thing through Father Steve. I was like, I've never seen anything like that before. So.
Yep. Todd, let me correct something I said a minute ago.
Sure.
There is an approved protocol for outdoor communion in 1B.
Okay.
I misspoke when I said there wasn't. There is. It's actually based, and which is why I got confused for a moment. It's based on a model that we tried at the ordinations that we did in June. Yeah. Those were indoors. We do not think we're quite there yet to be indoors, but that protocol that was used indoors for those ordinations can be used outdoors in stage 1B.
Okay, and so we might be, you know, again, it depends on what the trajectory is over the next week or so. August being August, that'll be sort of an interesting time to try some things outside. But I think, you know, certainly at St. Margaret's, I think we would be interested in trying to whatever opportunities we can to get together and worship, we're going to take advantage of and fully participate. So we'll find ways to do that. The challenge at St. Margaret's is that we have a lot of space, but nothing's really shaded, and so we've already started to scope out a few areas that might offer us some relief. And you know, it just means we're not doing something at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, we're going to be smart about this. So yeah. So that's 1B, and so that's going to be going on for a while. Let me. I've got a question. Might be about that. Okay, yeah, we'll get to that after we do. Let me finish this part, and then we'll ask that question. I don't know if you can see the chat. Can you see the chat?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we'll get right after that. So because we want to talk about that. That's I think the challenge is to Amy's question, and then we'll get to it here, is that it's so easy to get consumed with all the logistics of trying to do things that there's something a whole lot bigger going on that we're called to be a part of, whether we're in a pandemic or not. And so talking about who Jesus is and what this Jesus movement is really important. And so with that, so 1B is coming hopefully in the near future. And then after some specified period of time, I'm assuming, you know, and having been on the calls, you know, some more continued downward trajectory and some, you know, no spikes, and we feel like things have settled down or gotten better, that there'll be in-person worship at some point after that, correct?
In-person, indoor, right?
Yeah, indoor.
And that's what we're calling right now stage 2, and that's signaled by, in terms of the public health indicators for that, we're looking for 2 weeks in a row of a percentage, again, of positive cases versus overall tests of 7% or less. So,
okay.
And that is a benchmark that we feel is a good indicator that it's then safe to go indoors and to use the protocols. And there is one for communion as well as morning prayer, and you will have options around that at stage 2. The other thing that's happening in 1B is that baptisms outdoors are authorized, and you can move forward with those. It's a good idea to check with the bishop just to make sure we're on board with the specific details, but those are authorized, as well as outdoor weddings and graveside services have been allowed all along. In 1B, again, on a limited basis, we will allow, with permission from the bishop, a burial office or funeral service indoors, again, with a very limited amount of people. But it could be live streamed. So that will happen in 1B.
In fact, I don't know if we had a conversation weeks ago. You authorized a baptism that we're going to be doing with the family, very small group, at the end of August. And so we're excited to get our first. You know, we have a lot of baptisms at St. Margaret's, so we got them lined up. And so if you're one of those folks that hasn't gotten your child baptized, we're going to start opening that up a little bit to make those happen. But we do have one we do have one in the end of this month because there's some family coming into town on that same weekend. So, and then with that, we've also been in conversation, and we're within a day or two of being able to share with our preschool parents what preschool is going to look like coming up. And so I know preschools and opening schools. You want to touch on that for just a moment on what that's been like to navigate through, the plans to reopen and how that's been for you?
That's been the most challenging, Todd, and in part because, safety being a priority and caring for God's most vulnerable children, which includes a whole spectrum of people, but it certainly includes our children of all ages. It includes teachers and school staff, and where we've taken a err on the side of caution a bit with this pandemic, because there's so much that we don't know and so much that's been surprising and unpredictable. We've been cautious, and then we also recognize the need and importance for children of the opportunity to socialize, for families to get back into a routine of not having everything happen at home. And so we've been trying to do a balancing act of safety, but also accommodating those needs and concerns that are legitimate concerns in and among our congregations and our families. And Bishop Ann has taken a lead on, we had a team of folks who worked on some protocols for reopening of preschools and schools that are housed sometimes in churches. We're also looking at learning group gatherings for maybe in areas where schools are all virtual in the public schools, to provide some support for parents and families to have something on a limited basis in a church that can be a gathering for some learning and social time, again, with safety protocols in place, but to help those families. And so the team that formulated those protocols and worked with Bishop Ann, they have come up with some strong recommendations, and they are also working with congregations like yours that need, in terms of a timetable, to be free to move at a pace that may be different than our stages. So, and that is up and running. I know you've had conversations with Bishop Ann. She's talked with at least 5 or 6 other congregations, if not more. And we're committed to working with local leadership to give access and a little more flexibility, because the demand is very strong right now, and understandably so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure this isn't unique to us, but we have 74 children in our program. I think Christ Church has probably 200. We're close to Weddington United Methodist that has K through 8 and a preschool, over 200. So there's a lot of 2 working parent families in the area. So you get all that dynamic to kind of, to sift through. And so I really appreciate the diocese really trying to work with us to try to figure out the way to get this in a safe way, perhaps open in a different way than waiting for a later stage. So we're still having those conversations, but we think that we're close. I don't want to go too long after this without addressing this from Amy. Wants to know if you could briefly explain more about the Jesus movement in North Carolina that you referenced. And
sure.
Yes.
That's Amy. I'm referencing messaging from Bishop Curry when he was the bishop here in North Carolina. As you know, he's my predecessor now, our presiding bishop. And he really, while he was leading and serving here, began to talk about the Jesus movement in terms of what it means to be a disciple and an apostle in the 21st century church. And there's a whole range of things that from the gospel record we know we're called to do and be. And how do we as a church really prioritize, lift that up, support and celebrate that? And how do we live into that as our vocation as the body of Christ in this place and time? And what are the ways that we can take those timeless messages that come from the Gospels and come from the scripture stories and come from the stories of Jesus' life and put them in our contemporary context with all the integrity of our tradition, but also with the flexibility of adapting our way of reaching out, of connecting, of building community that lifts up the gospel values, but is rooted in our current context and some of the challenges. And so in a lot of ways, that was pretty helpful preparation for this very challenging experience that we've just been going through, because it teaches by its nature a kind of adaptive leadership style, where you take the fundamental, the essential beliefs that we all share, and you say, how can we mold, shape, and adapt those in a way that is inviting to people in the 21st century and with the challenges that we currently face, without watering down the message. And that's a great creative challenge. And so we've taken some of that we practice in that sort of iteration, and then we tried to bring that to this work that we've been engaged in over the past 5 months.
Yeah, and as we talk about the Jesus movement, it's really interesting. I mentioned this earlier, just in passing, but I really do think one of the particular challenges right now is that we had to go into survival mode so quickly as a nation, as a world, and we certainly do that as individuals and as institutions. And it's the challenge is not to get so inwardly focused that we forget that somehow within this new reality that we're living in right now, we're still called to reach out and be the people of God and followers of Jesus, and we're supposed to build Jesus' kingdom. And so what does that look like in the time of a pandemic in which you can't, when you have we're in stage 2, stay at home, right? And so how do you do that is you stay at home, and you do some through Zoom. But what's also been interesting with that in an educational standpoint for me, or a revelation for me, is we talk about reaching out and how do we care and tend for each other and be Jesus to one another. I remember asking one of our parishioners, just checking in during, probably 2 months in, just to see how they were doing. One of our older parishioners that lives in an assisted living facility, and she had a really interesting response when I asked her how she was doing with all this. And intellectually, I should have known this, but her response was really, one of those revelatory moments. She's like, this really isn't any different than it's for me every day of my life as it is. I kind of live in this small room and do interact some, but the fact is this is not that much different than what I typically live in most of the time, except my family is not able to come as much. And I thought, well, there's a good reminder. I think there's a reason in the gospel that widows and orphans and the elderly are always lifted up as people we should be reaching out to. And it was, I think at St. Margaret's we do a good job with that, but it was just one of those moments where someone says something, you realize, yeah, I'm on a personal way, I'm feeling something in a very short time, for a very short period, I think, that other people are experiencing on a regular basis for months and years at a time, and it's not going to change for them. And what's the church's role in not forgetting about them once this pandemic's over? At least for me, it was one of those moments. It was a simple thing she said, but I was like, wow, I should have known that, but I didn't know that. So part of that Jesus movement. So I continue to ask you questions. I think, so anything else you want to say about the church and pandemic and church openings, or you feel we covered all that, or anything we missed? Or
Well, just to pick up on the thread you were just talking about, the importance of pastoral care, the one-to-one visits that are so much a part of my ministry, both as a bishop and previously as a priest, and I know of yours, Todd, as a priest, just the kind of blessed, sacred, intimate opportunity to share faith, to share prayer, to share communion in people's homes, which has also been interrupted, and because it breaks through the isolation and some of the loneliness that particularly those who are, for various reasons, like the situation you described, not able always to get out. And that's been probably alongside of the interruption in visitations, the interruption in pastoral visits for me has been the place where I feel the grief the deepest. Yeah. We are now relaxing some of those restrictions as well. We have protocols to visit outside with mass social distancing. We're even allowing indoor visits for 15 minutes or less, which is a step. It's not where we want to be, but it helps. And again, masks and social distancing, but 15 minutes inside. We can't yet extend that to people who actually have the COVID-19 virus, but we can do it for other folks who are homebound. And so it's good to be able to say that.
Yeah, that's a great one, because I shared this with you earlier when we talked a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you remember or not, but the moment sort of as a priest where I struggled the most before we were able to do any visits. It was early in the pandemic, but I had a parishioner who passed away, and so did the holy prayers. I couldn't anoint him, obviously, but I did the prayers over the phone, and it was still holy. I want to be clear about that. There was still a sacredness to it. There was still a holiness to it, but I also wasn't there in that same way physically. And I remember hanging up, well, we don't hang up phones anymore. I turned off my phone. Generational, I can't hang up a phone anymore. But I think that's one of those moments where I was really aware that I was angry after the fact. It's like my thought was, I'm his priest and I should be there with him and his family right there. And that was one of those moments where, and there were some other things going on that week, it sort of started stacking on each other, but I became angry that this virus in our current context was keeping me away when I thought I was really needed to be there. But I don't want to take away from the fact there was still a sacredness to it. It's very different to do that over the phone. But I found myself right after, like, this thing's keeping me away from people that really need, and not me as a person, but that priestly presence to bring that holy presence into that moment. And so I'm glad that we're able to see a little bit of opening to that, because we can do some visitations and some, in a case like that, I'd have that 15, that time to go in there and take care of the folks. So that's good. A question came up in chat, just a general question, I'll put it this way, but explain some of the thoughts on, I know there's some studies on singing in church, because I know I mentioned earlier, we may not be able to sing in the same way. So what have you, what have we learned? I know there's a lot of articles and some scientific studies about singing in church, and so I'm under the understanding that's a heightened way to spread the virus potentially. And so my sense is there's going to be a limitation on that for a while. What are your thoughts as people are asking a little bit about that? So.
Yeah, the more we learned, the deeper we got into this pandemic, and the more that sort of data, stories, and research began to surface, the more concern began to be expressed about what they call the aerosol transmission, which may, in fact, although I don't know this, and I am far from a scientist, I just try and read and absorb as much as I can, but at this point, it may be that the transmission through the air is more problematic than touch transmission. I'm not stating that as a fact, but I'm stating that as something that some of the data has raised that question. And so that's why masks, which weren't necessarily called for in the beginning when we didn't know this, now more and more you hear all kinds of health authorities, government authorities stressing the importance of masking, because the aerosol, it's different than the droplets, which are also dangerous, but the aerosol is airborne and it stays in the air for a period of time. And if the virus is riding one of those, that's where the infection can get transferred. And singing, of course, you project a lot out from your lungs. And if you happen to have the virus, then it's a significant cause for concern. We've all heard a number of the anecdotal accounts of churches where choirs sang and where multiple people got infected, and that's made all of us be very cautious about singing. Doesn't mean that we don't allow music, and we're finding other ways through the live stream and so forth to incorporate music. And there have been some significant studies done during the month of July, and we're just waiting for that data to be released. And if the data indicates that we've been a little too cautious and we can relax those, we certainly will. We're waiting now on that data.
Yeah, that's the real challenge with this. It's just relatively speaking, we're still early in this pandemic. I mean, from a virus standpoint, we're so used to instantaneous information, but in these sorts of cases, you just aren't going to know day two what's really going on. And so I think this is one of those things that as we learn more, I think this is with everything, whether it's preschool, whether it's church, whether it's public schools, that it's going to be a choppy sort of existence. Like you may get going and then take a step back or two steps forward. I think it's going to be really interesting. Or you might not start singing, but then we learn, well, maybe it's not as bad, or maybe it's worse, and then you make adjustments as you need. And I think that's a challenge for all of us. That let me speak for me personally, that just sort of like that plan and like to kind of go with yeah, it's going to be less of that able to us because we're going to learn more as we go. So, but I know that, that's such a part of the Anglican tradition is that congregational singing, and where do we do that anywhere else? Where do we come together and sing together except at church? And so, knowing my classical music background, people know I'm ready to sing whenever we're ready to go. But we'll learn some more. I got another question from Elizabeth. So that's Elizabeth Pfeiffer because it says Elizabeth me, so it's her. The Episcopal Church is filled with tangible rituals, Eucharist, baptism, confirmation, ordination. How are you two connecting to our rituals without service and those rites that mean so much to us? That's from a personal basis. So that, I think what I'm hearing from Elizabeth, that we connect as a community. There's also that priestly and bishop function that's such a part of how we connect with each other. How's that? I mean, my short answer is it's been a loss for me. I mean, there's no way to really replace that. To stand at the altar and offer the sacrifice of the Eucharist, you can't. I love watching baseball, but it doesn't quite, fill the need for that, right? I mean, there's no way. And so for me, it's almost been a grieving process over the last 5 months of having to learn to live mostly without. And then when those few glimpses in which I began to function as a priest, there's like this reinvigoration. We had a very distant outdoor. We had with our graduating high school seniors this past weekend. We all spread out and we gave them their scarves that were made for them, prayer scarves, and with their school colors, and I blessed them. It was just energizing to get to be a priest again with people around. And so I think that's indicative of a grieving process that I've been going through over the past 5 months of still being priestly functioning, but it looks very different. And the things that are so dear to me, been separated from those for a long time. So that's my answer. I don't know if it's a good answer, but that's where I am. So
I like that answer a lot. Loss was the first word that came to my mind when you asked the question. But rather than reiterate what you just said so beautifully, there's one other dimension to a loss that I've been trying to explore, and it's part of those sort of spiritual disciplines that sometimes become a gift of grace, or as Bishop Curry would say, a habit of grace during a time like this. And that's fasting. And what I want to say about that is fasting, we normally typically associate that with food and abstaining from food for a period of time. And some may remember, others may not. Bishop Curry actually at the beginning of Lent invited anyone who wanted to take the Wednesdays in Lent and fast and to pray for the well-being and the health and the life of our country. And I thought, what a great idea. I'm going to do that for Lent. And I thought after Lent ended, Easter came and I would set that discipline aside. But there was something about it that actually, particularly when the pandemic hit, that just in a way I can't quite yet put into words, it just seemed right. So I just kept doing it. And Bishop Curry actually said he was going to do it all the way through the election. Today's Wednesday, I'm still doing it. I didn't ever expect to last this long. I'm a friend of mine, when I described this experience, he said, "Oh, well, I've aged out of fasting." And honestly, I thought I had too, but it's come back in a way. Yeah. And when I think about the question of the rituals that mean so much and that feed us spiritually and us as clergy, to offer those, which is such an essential part of our vocational life, to miss that is like a fast. But a fast with a purpose or with a focus can actually have some meaning. And that's what I'm trying to explore, live into, and learn from in this time of pandemic, which is not to say that the absence of the sacrament is okay. It's not. It's to say, in having being forced really to set it aside, what ways am I discovering that God can feed me and feed us that actually it's not a substitute for the sacrament, but it's an expansion of what the sacrament promises. The sacrament's at the center, but the center radiates out. And as we're in a time when what was at the center is not available to us, we need to get in touch with what's radiated out for centuries from the sacrament about how God is available to us through that promise, which we can't access at the center.
Yeah. In a different way, what you're saying is almost what we touched on earlier. You know, when I mentioned you, it feels like God's shown me, okay, you've been so into planning, so right now you've got to learn how to live in the moment. And so it's just from a sacramental standpoint. So there's a fast from this right now, but there's different ways for you to live into your faith, and what do those look like? And so I think it's sort of interesting to think of it that way. It does feel like we've had an awfully long Lent. You know, there's been no Easter celebration the same way, no Pentecost, and we're doing the, you know, we're doing the virtual offerings, but for me at least, it's nice to have, but it's just not the same as being drawn together in community and worshiping together. So quite next question from Nancy Armstrong asks, what's the current thinking about the common cup, common chalice?
So for now, and this is one of those ironies, Nancy, so let me just speak very frankly. The irony is the jury is out really from a scientific standpoint about whether the common chalice is a vehicle or a vector of transmission of this virus. Nobody's saying it is, and nobody's saying it isn't. And the fact of the matter is that the perception is, and because the way we receive the common cup, almost by necessity, it sort of breaks down the social isolation if we're going to be giving it to each other as we normally do. So we have continued, even though we are now finding ways to offer communion first outdoors and then indoors, we are not sharing the cup at this time. I cannot say that there's hard science behind that. I can say that is one of those areas where we're erring on the side of caution because we just don't know. As you probably know, Nancy, though, in our tradition, to receive the sacrament in one kind, whether it be the bread or the wine, is to receive the full gracious efficacy of the sacrament. And that's a long-standing tradition. So even though that still too is a loss, it's important to be able to uphold what we can do and what we can celebrate.
Yeah, I haven't seen any. I haven't followed science on that, so it'll be interesting to see if they've done some or will do some studies on that. I'd love to see what they. At least historically, there hasn't been a sense that that's been a purveyor of viruses. At least the ones that have come before, but there again, it's unknown with this particular virus. So it's hard to know what the right thing to do is. So it's a challenge.
And to your point, just a quick. I do remember. I think it was the H1N1 flu a few years back when I was serving as rector of St. Michael's Milton, and we had an active discussion in our vestry about the common cup, and some people said, "Oh, we should just intinct," and the medical people said that is worse than, which was a revelation to some of us. So in the end, in that one, we didn't eliminate the common cup, but we did not allow people to intinct.
Yeah, I do get. I don't know. Again, you might know more. I don't know if the House of Bishops has discussed this at all yet. But my sense is that the days of intinction might be gone. I mean, because what is clear is that it is the easiest way to transmit all sorts of, like, if there's a transmission, that's where it would happen. So I'm curious as to whether that might maybe that's something that hasn't come up, or if it has, maybe you're not allowed to talk about it. But I wouldn't be surprised if at some point that becomes an option that's not available to us. It's discouraged in the prayer book, isn't it? I mean, it's really discouraged.
It is discouraged. It is allowed, but it is discouraged. And there are many people who've had mixed feelings about it right from the get-go. And it has not yet been discussed. You asked, Todd, whether it was brought up at the House of Bishops. Not at least in a part of any conversation I participated in yet. I do think you're right. Eventually it'll come up. I think it'll be a ways down the road, simply because, as you point out, we've had so much loss right now that for those people for whom that is meaningful or matters, the last thing we want to do is create another loss right now. So
absolutely, yeah. All right. So let's see. Another question. Okay, so we spent a lot, and there's a lot of energy over the church stuff. I didn't with this time for and just to let you know, Bishop, I kind of put aside till 8:15 if that works for you. If it for some reason we go a little bit longer, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I didn't want our time with you to go by without being able to at least, this is the first time we've seen you and talked to you since we've had the racial tensions in our communities in our country surface in a very particular way with George Floyd, obviously, and the reaction of that and the horrendous nature of that. So just kind of want to get your thoughts on where we are. I've lost track of the date of George Floyd's death. We're talking, I just lose track of the time, but it's been several months, it feels. Or a
I
couple
know it was early June. I want to say June 2nd, but that's just, I can't.
I can't tell what day it is half the time anymore. So a couple of months though, but it's been a really, it's come to the forefront again, the issues of race in our country. And so this is our chance to hear from you on what some of your thoughts are, and what's the church's role as we address issues of race. The last time we did this conversation, I did it with the local AME Zion pastor, Haven Anderson, and had a wonderful conversation, really a chance to hear from his perspective. It was more me just sitting here letting him share with us what life is like to experience, in his case, as a black man growing up in this country, and the different challenges for him that folks that don't go through that might not understand. But from a bishop in a church that certainly is not exclusively white, but demographically, you look at our demographics and it tends to be mostly white. In many areas tends to be a more affluent community, although it's not always that case. But from our context, what does that look like for us, and what's our call as our bishop? What do you see our role is in this?
Yeah, thank you, Todd. As you know, that has been front and center in the work that we've been doing together around becoming beloved community, really since before I got here. But that became a focus not long after I arrived, really because the groundwork had been laid. There was a lot of energy around having those conversations, looking at our own history, understanding the church's role in some of this, and actually trying to put our own, tell the truth about our own stories, and pay attention to the ways that we've participated in what we often call systemic racism, which is a complicated, difficult term, but an important term to understand, because it conveys the fact that there's a reality, a sea that we're all swimming in that we're not always conscious of, that actually enhances the discrimination there's some obvious kinds of discrimination that we see and recognize and name and reject, but there are subtler forms that actually reinforce that kind of discrimination that we don't see as easily or identify as easily, because they're kind of embedded in the structures of society. And that's what we call systemic racism. And that, it turns out, is becoming more and more the focus of our work. We had for years in this diocese a training, an anti-racism training called Seeing the Face of God in Each Other. And it's a great training. It's similar to a program that was offered in the Diocese of Massachusetts when I was there. But recently it was reworked with the help, direction, and consultation of Dr. Catherine Meeks, who's the director of the Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta, which is a center for racial reconciliation and healing. And they changed the name of the program, and they now call it Dismantling Racism, Reclaiming Our Baptismal Covenant. And really at the heart of that is the gospel value that Jesus lifts up of the dignity of every human being as a child of God. And we know this, and we live this, and what we realize and are starting to recognize more and more is that there are systems within the society that actually get in the way of that upholding of another person's dignity. And there are obvious examples like Jim Crow and other things throughout our history. We know of this sort of prison pipeline that particularly impacts young men of color in this country, and we know about the inequities in our educational system, and all of those pieces are aspects of systemic racism that we see as the church we need to begin to help dismantle. But we have to clean our own house too and put our own house in order, because as we look at our own history, we can see examples of where we also participated in such systems. And when I say the church, and I don't mean just in the South.
Right, yeah.
You know that in the North, where I come from, those embedded systems of racism are every bit as present, every bit as destructive, and really need to be, the light needs to be shown upon them so we can dismantle them. I'm going on, so.
Oh, I got you. I got you. And it's actually, you know, when you talk about it, being from the Boston area, again, you know, I'm a sports fan, and I was watching something recently that I just wasn't aware of because I love that the whole story of the Red Sox, especially in 2004 when they came back and they won. I thought that was a great team and a great story, and that's what I love about sports when you have those great stories. But I was interested and just wasn't aware that even for some modern day baseball players, that it's written in their contract that like Boston is not a place that they ever want to go play. And this is just unaware on my part because of their experience as a visiting player in that stadium. They've experienced treatment that they don't experience any other places. And I didn't have that history of Boston, you know, even in, you know, the year 2019 and 2020, that was still, you know, there's some people that we're not going to play in that area. There's, you know, sometimes there's this natural assumption, well, the South is this way, the North is this way. And then you got that experience in Boston. So being aware of that, you know, again, cluelessness on my part. I never really lived in that part of the country, so don't know as much about it. But I was really surprised by that there's current players today that's off their list because of the racial tensions they feel within that particular stadium. And so you're a Boston area person. You may know more about that than I do, but I found that completely astounding. I never knew that. So I think we can all be blind to our own stuff, and sometimes we need someone to help us see that. So,
no, that's right, Todd, and that's actually, sadly, an apt example of how systemic racism works, and particularly in the North. I just finished a book, as I said I was reading earlier, another book on this subject of dismantling racism called White Fragility. It's mostly about the insidious nature of systemic racism. And one of the points it makes, which you just underscored with the example of Boston in particular as a very racially divided city, and Fenway Park as an example of a long history of racial discrimination that just kind of permeates the atmosphere. And one of the points that was made in the book is that actually, in many respects, the South is further along in this battle because people, it's out there, it wasn't hidden. People were dealing with it because it was in the open, whereas in the North, it's been kind of underground. It's been in the system, it's been invisible. And that is very toxic in ways that we don't experience here in the South because at least we know when it's happening.
Yeah, okay. And so a question I have, this is more for me, I think, than anybody else. Nobody's written anything in, but one of the things that I think is a challenge as we have this conversation in particular, but about a lot of conversations, even within the church, is that we are so politically polarized in this country. That even we're so polarized that even when we're talking about the wearing of masks, right, that becomes a politicized issue, and you can see it in the polls because if you're a conservative Republican, it says this many, you know, overwhelming majority of people don't want to wear a mask. If you're a progressive Democrat, you do. So we've somehow been able to politicize even the wearing of the mask, and so I see that sometimes, or feel that sometimes, even within the church, that sometimes we can easily slip into, all of us can easily slip into our political separations rather than addressing things like race from a theological standpoint. So do you feel that too sometimes, or is that just me? And if you do, how do we have a gospel-centered approach as opposed to a politically divisive language? Does that make sense?
Makes great sense, yeah. And it's one of the biggest challenges that we face as a country right now. And it really is part of the reason Bishop Curry issued that invitation to fast. And I think he was an exceptional leader in finding middle ground, finding common ground, and calling us together around gospel values. And that's where we try, and we've tried to follow that path and build out sort of that common ground in little ways as we are able. Just this week, yesterday, in fact, Bishop Ann and I had the opportunity to meet with staff members of our two senators from North Carolina around some issues of legislation that are up for votes coming up in Congress. And what we did in that conversation is lead from the things that we share. We share with our two senators who happen to be Republican. We share gospel values. They're people of faith. They have deep concern for the people of North Carolina, and they recognize and respect the gospel call to reach out and care for the most vulnerable. So that was the beginning of our conversation. And then building on that, we talked about certain aspects of legislation that we thought lifted up and celebrated those values and tried to connect those to the values. We weren't meeting this time with the senators, we were meeting with their staff, both of whom are from North Carolina and were educated here. But we felt that we were building a bridge. And we made, one of the issues that came up was voter access during this upcoming election. And we made it clear that that's not a partisan issue. We just want everybody to be able to have access to exercise their right to vote, because that is a bedrock of our democracy. And that can and should be a nonpartisan issue. That should be something that we all want to uphold, uplift, and fight for. Now, when you get into the weeds, there are nuances and differences, and that's where the common ground sometimes breaks down. Right. There is a fundamental loss of trust in this country among people who have different political perspectives. That's an ongoing piece of work that's going to take some time.
And we would see that within our church. I mean, I think the challenge is we can become a bit tribal in the way our churches kind of form around themselves. I don't think I'm blind to this, because I do think St. Margaret's is one of those places that we're just this conglomeration of just a whole mess load of people with a whole mess load of ideas. And there's some messiness to that. I mean, there's people all over the map on any given issue, whether it's political or theological. And it's a hard thing to do, but there's been a real, I've tried to, don't know how successful, but a real attempt to try to make this a place that we gather at the Lord's table. You know, we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and we believe that he rose from the dead. There's a lot of stuff that we have, like you talk about, that common faith that's embedded in our creeds. And the other stuff might be really, really important, but we may not have to be exactly articulating the exact same things on some other issues, and still, in order to be able to come, we can still come together despite some of these differences. And it's hard to sift through that, but I think it's worth the effort to try to do that. But I do think sometimes churches can be just as divisive, right? We want to go to a place that feels right, and no matter how we mean that, it could be, it's got the right beliefs for what I want, and I want to go there. I almost think the model back historically, where you had a town and you had your church, and that was sort of it, right? You had to sort of learn to live with each other. I wonder whether that model had some benefits to it that we lose these days, because we can sort of go to different places if we have difficulties, rather than having to be, lack of a better word, forced into a relationship that you got to maintain. I don't know, just my thoughts on that. So it's sort of interesting. So, but what the House of Bishops? So what has it been like during this time of racial unrest and being separated physically from the House of Bishops in order to do the work that bishops do during this time as far as racial? Has it been added challenge? Has it worked pretty well anyway, or what's that been like for you?
We had a meeting last week, 2 days of a virtual meeting that will be finishing up in September. So there's 3 parts to it, and 2 of them were last week, and the last part will be in mid-September. Sorry, I may have said November. I meant September. In any case, one of the subjects we did tackle last week was making a statement of solidarity from the bishops around dismantling racism. And what was important to me about this statement, and to others as well, is that it wasn't just a statement of what we stand for, it was a statement of action, what we are going to actually do in terms of the way that we operate and conduct business in the House of Bishops, and certain benchmarks and expectations, and holding each other accountable. And then there was also the expectation that each bishop in their respective dioceses will engage in this work around truth-telling, around looking at, as we've already talked about and been doing here, looking at our own history, the stories of discrimination, systemic and otherwise, and how that continues to impact and challenge us as a church, and particularly place an undue burden on people of color in our congregations and on those congregations. As you know, we had a diocesan convention, not last year, but the year before, where we heard the story of 3 of our historic African-American congregations, and the ups and downs. And in many ways, it was a story of the pain and suffering of the cross, but they were also stories of resurrection. And you could see the gospel hope shining out in those stories. And when we do this work as a church, that's what we discover. So it's important to do the work and be honest, and also to look for the signs of God's presence, God's hope, God's resurrection power, even as we're hearing our own history.
Well, I appreciate all that, and thank you for sharing all this. And I know we've been over a lot of things. We've gone from your bio to coronavirus to church openings to preschool openings into racial tensions. That's a lot to cover sort of in an hour and 15 minutes. But I first and foremost want to thank you for being with us and being willing to kind of give us your thoughts and be in conversation together. Again, I know this has been a crazy few months, and I just know that you've got a lot of demands on your time, and so I appreciate you making some time for that. But any questions for us? I mean, before we let you go, any questions for me or for the people of St. Margaret's, or any parting wisdom for us that you want to give to us?
Well, and this won't surprise you, Todd, but I just want to make sure that you're getting a break or some rest. And this has been stressful for our parish clergy, and my deep care for you just leads me to ask, are you getting a vacation? Have you had some time off? Is that coming up, or will you?
I'll tell you this, and this is going to be a bad answer. I shouldn't answer this, but my wife and I did take 2 days. We've been here for 12 years and I had never been to Boone, which is embarrassing to say. And so we found a little lodge there. So I did take 2 days at some point, I think it was June, not what I should be doing. And I don't know when that break's going to happen, because your Father Lito, unfortunately, is getting ready to leave us here. We're marking that fairly soon. But to your question, no, I haven't gotten the break that I should be doing. When I give these great analogies about masks coming down in the airplanes and put your own mask on first, I'm not sure that I'm living that the way that I should, and so I put that out there. But if the parish wants to pressure me to do that, I'm happy to get you to do that. Who did this?
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat box, Todd. I think they're saying, yes, give them more time. So
yeah, that sounds like Elizabeth. That's an Elizabeth or Joni comment for sure. So they've been seeing me. But to your point, if I'm being, and I would not be dishonest with my bishop, I have not exhibited what I should be doing in that particular area. But I'll endeavor to do better on that. But it feels. I think another challenge for me during this is that even when I'm not actively working, I'm not disconnected in the same way. It feels like there's this constant connection, and I think it's because I don't know if you're feeling this, but we're constantly doing everything through technology, and so therefore it feels like there's never a clear break from it. If that makes sense, that is
it off. Yes.
It really is. So that's the real challenge, and so I will endeavor to do better, especially if we've got. It sounds like we have a few more weeks before we got worship coming up, so we'll see what we can come up with. So, would you? I'd love for you to pray for us before leave, but I also, if I could, I've got a prayer that I found. It's actually a Catholic prayer, but it's a prayer specifically for bishops. And so if you would allow me to pray that, and then I'll just sort of hand it over to you, if you wouldn't mind, and pray for us and bless us as we go out. I'd love it if you're okay with that. So
I'd love to. That's a perfect way to end, Todd.
So I thought this was a lovely prayer that I found. I hope it speaks to you, but it's a way that we can pray for our bishop. If this were Bishop Ann, we'd be praying this for her, but since you're here, we're praying for Bishop Sam in this way. But this is a prayer I offer from all of us as we pray for our bishop this night. God, eternal shepherd, you tend your church in many ways and rule us with love. You have chosen your servant Sam to be a shepherd of your flock. Give him a spirit of courage and right judgment, a spirit of knowledge and love. By governing with fidelity those entrusted to his care, May he build your church as a sign of salvation for the world. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. And God, we thank you for Father Todd, for St. Margaret's, for the staff team, for the lay leaders, for the congregation, for their faithfulness, for their perseverance, their deep trust in you, and all the hard work that's gone into building and creating community in this challenging time. Lift them up, help them to feel the strength of your Spirit, help them to feel the promise of that fresh, new opportunities that are coming to us in and through all this, in spite of all this. Help us to care for them in their grief. Help us to make space for the losses. Help us to feel deeply the painful moments so that we can also be touched by your healing love, by the grace and gift that you've given us in each other, and by the opportunities that lie ahead, even as we learn new ways to worship you and to praise your name. We also give special thanks for the traditions that bring us comfort, for the familiarity that speaks to us of your presence and of your love. Help us to experience those again soon in deeper and fuller ways as we begin to regather. And now, Lord, bless us. Bless our families and our friends. Bless the gifts you give that do not end. Keep us strong. Help us to grow and to know the peace of your love, because that is our home. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bishop Sam. In fact, as I disconnect, if you wouldn't mind just hanging on for a couple more seconds to make sure we get this the way it needs to go. But I will say this, just as a way to end together. I do believe this is the first time that I've had a conversation like this with no shoes on with the bishop. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
That means we were on holy ground, Todd.
That's what it was. It's exactly right. But thank you for your time, folks. Thanks for being here. If you have more questions, you can always put them in the box. I'm always in conversation with Bishop Sam or regularly are, and so I'm happy to pass those along. But hope you have a blessed night, and we'll see you all soon. Take care, and God bless you. Good night.